Today, Brahms's first piano concerto is regarded as one of the dramatic Everests of the concerto repertoire. It's very, very popular. It's the sort of concerto that can really fill a concert hall. So it's hard to imagine that there was ever a time when it was considered very modernist indeed and extremely difficult. But I've just been looking into Brahms's correspondence about the time, and he was pretty glum after he played the first performance in January 1859. He was still in his 20s then. My concerto has had a brilliant and decisive failure, he wrote after the premiere. Here's a few other things. At the conclusion, 3 pairs of hands were brought together very slowly, whereupon a perfectly distinct hissing from all sides forbade any further such demonstration. There is nothing more to say about this episode, for not a soul has said a word to me about the work afterwards. And then, of course, there were the reviews. One reviewer says that the concerto has nothing to offer but hopeless desolation and aridity. For more than 3/4 of an hour one must endure this rooting and rummaging, this straining and tugging, this tearing and patching of phrases and flourishes. Not only must one take in this fermenting mess, one must also swallow a dessert of the shrillest dissonances and most unpleasant sounds. Now it's one of the most popular concertos in the repertory. Mind you, I do kind of think I possibly see a little bit of the point of that first reaction, why people were so unready for it. When Brahms was writing this concerto in the middle of the 19th century, concertos, generally speaking, were really entertaining pieces. They were about the scintillating, exciting, charismatic virtuoso. It was usually a he, but sometimes it was a she, and they would be like great acrobats putting on a great display, or magicians. You would sit there with your mouth open wondering how anyone could do such things. But the idea of any great emotional profundity probably went a little bit by the by. But when Brahms wrote this concerto, it was actually the product of a very long and difficult emotional struggle. He turned up in the mid-50s on the doorstep of his idol, the composer Robert Schumann. He was only 20, and he was clutching a handful of pieces that he'd written to show Schumann. Schumann was absolutely bowled over and immediately told Brahms he was a genius and that he was going to succeed Beethoven. He was the composer destined to take up the baton from Beethoven, which is quite a burden, actually, to lay on a young composer, isn't it? And it was a terribly difficult burden for Brahms. But then it all just got more and more complicated. Schumann, always unstable, finally tipped over the edge the following year, threw himself into the River Rhine, was rescued, but spent the last 2 years of his life in an asylum. Meanwhile, Brahms had obviously fallen deeply in love with Schumann's much younger wife, Clara. Schumann herself, a very fine composer and pianist, an outstanding pianist. And the consequences of all this, finding the artistic father figure he always wanted, only to lose him almost immediately, to be burdened with this incredible burden of expectation, and then to fall in love with Schumann's potential widow. It's all, well, it's complicated. And the concerto really grew out of this. Brahms was so confused he didn't originally know what it was that he was writing. Was it a symphony? Was it a sonata for 2 pianos? Eventually he decided on a kind of compromise, put the piano and the symphony together and come up with a concerto. But the result is a concerto that's as grand, as ambitious, and as impassioned and stirring and searching as any of Beethoven's great symphonies. I think maybe that's one reason why we can be a bit kind to that first audience. That, you know, this was something unlike anything they'd ever had to digest before. And it is very intense and quite hard-edged in places at times. So yeah, okay, this was a difficult piece. It's also pretty hard to believe that at its first performance, that incredibly much loved Russian symphony, Tchaikovsky's Pathétique, was also a bit of a flop. But it was. And then a few days later it was performed again and it was a huge success. But then into the intervening period, something pretty extraordinary had happened. Tchaikovsky, who was only 53, had died. There was a great mysterious quality about this. What had happened? Had he committed suicide? Someone said that they'd seen him deliberately drinking unboiled tap water in cholera-infested Petersburg. That's a pretty bizarre way to want to kill yourself. Pretty horrible way, too. All sorts of rumours grew up that actually Tchaikovsky was horrified about the truth about his homosexual relationship with a member of the royal family getting out. But that doesn't quite add up with all the information. And some terrific conspiracy theories have grown up around this. And all of them did absolutely no harm at all to the symphony's reputation. Here was this dark, impassioned, finally deeply minor key, bleak ending of a symphony. And here it was being heard again hardly any time at all after Tchaikovsky himself had died mysteriously. All sorts of questions grew up. Had Tchaikovsky seen his own end when he wrote this extraordinary piece? Was it a sort of requiem for himself? There was even a quotation in the first movement from the Russian funeral chant, the Kontakion. Surely that was significant. Well, we just don't know. Actually, when Tchaikovsky was writing the symphony, he was incredibly excited by it. You've no idea what bliss I feel. And then follows a kind of teasing recommendation. Be assured that my time has not yet passed and that I can still work. However, there is a program to this music, but the program, it will remain a mystery to everyone. Let them guess what it is. And people have been, well, they've been playing that game ever since. The truth is that this is a very, very, well, it's a work that actually just seems to run through the whole gamut, if you like, of the emotional spectrum. The beginning is one of the bleakest openings to a symphony in the repertory. You have double basses down here and a hollow bassoon. Yeah, that sounds pretty dark. And at the end of the symphony, we end in the bleakest of chords of B minor, with a comment of what sounds like a kind of faltering, dying heartbeat underneath. Surely Tchaikovsky was onto something. He knew something was coming. But the fact is, Tchaikovsky was obsessed with death all the way through his life. He was one of those people with an extremely hypersensitive, as we would say now, morbid temperament. He couldn't bear to be around people who were seriously ill because it would make him think about death. He was enacting death scenes over and over again in his operas, and his tone poems, and his orchestral works. So maybe this is just the most vivid in a series of a long line of works in which he works out this very dark obsession of his. But there's still something irresistibly, well, I mean, of all Tchaikovsky's works, it's the one that seems to encompass just about every side of his nature, from the delight and the pleasure and the playfulness we see in great ballet scores like the Nutcracker, right through to the most dark, fate-obsessed music that we can imagine, as in, for instance, the Fourth Symphony, or in the opera The Queen of Spades. And then at the end, very unusually for a symphony in the 19th century, the Pathétique ends with a slow movement, a very dark slow movement. Now, a warning here, the third movement, which is like an incredibly exciting march, is so invigorating and its end is so magnificently conclusive that a lot of people actually fall into Tchaikovsky's trap and clap at this point. This must be the end of the symphony, but it isn't. Suddenly there's a dramatic reversal, and from the almost manic elation of the third movement, we're plunged into the deepest, darkest sadness. It's music that I can't hear actually myself without feeling a real tug in my heart. You know, Tchaikovsky is getting to some very deeply personal stuff here. So we just don't know whether Tchaikovsky knew that he wasn't long for this world. But in a way it doesn't really matter, because the symphony, like all great symphonies, tells its own story. And what an incredibly powerful, gripping story it is. And it's the kind of story, I'm sure, that'll make you want to go back again and explore further. What's he saying here? Why does he do this after that? Why these extraordinary changes? Why is the wonderful seeming love theme in the first movement one of his greatest melodies, followed by such an incredible outburst of anger and rage and terror in the middle of the movement? It's just, I think, the most extreme orchestral piece Tchaikovsky wrote. But it's so rich and wonderful, and as so typically with Tchaikovsky, so full of good tunes, that in the end, for all its darkness, I think it's a marvellously uplifting piece too. And in the end, that's what tragedy, great tragedy, is all about.